Welcome to Mavericks. I'm Joey Garcia, and in today's episode, we'll be speaking to one of the brightest minds in blockchain. He's the co-founder of Gnosis, which has built out new market mechanisms for decentralized finance. He's a visionary and a maverick. It's Martin Köppelmann. This is Mavericks, brought to you by Xapo Bank. Well, Martin, good morning. It's great to have you here today. Martin, I thought we can just start having a chat or a discussion, and I think it'd be really great to know a bit of your background, sort of starting off. We worked years ago together,
right?
How did the whole thing start? What was your baby step into the universe of Ethereum and everything around that, or Gnosis? What were the steps that got you to that point?
Yeah, it certainly started many years ago with Bitcoin, because that was essentially the only thing that was around back then. And yeah, I don't exactly even remember the story how I first heard about it, but certainly then I got fascinated about it, both from two perspectives. One, purely from a technical perspective. I'm a computer scientist, so from that perspective, it's super interesting, Bitcoin. But of course, also from a broader perspective, and a little bit raising the question, what is money? How does money work? How do we as a society decide what money are we using? Are we deciding this actively at all? Is there a debate about that? And all those questions were raised by Bitcoin, and that's how I got interested.
And then Martin, around the Bitcoin point, I think you started with Fele,
exactly,
which is a form of prediction market. Was that the basic starting point pre-Gnosis?
Exactly. So that was a small project we did on the side while being at university. I did already with Stefan, my co-founder from Gnosis. But then, things got more serious, and we met Joe Lubin and Consensus at the time where Ethereum just had done their kind of fundraise token sale, and Joe was forming Consensus to build lots of applications around Ethereum, and we then decided to join Consensus and start building Gnosis, which was initially a very similar concept to Fairlay, but say, well, let's now do it on Ethereum with the much more powerful tools Ethereum offers.
And back then, Martin, Consensus was, a relatively small office, right? Down in Brooklyn or something. It was a very startup sort of point, right?
Absolutely, sure. So at the beginning, it was, really more or less a loose collection of people. Essentially, people would go to meetups and talk about Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Joe would try to bring them all into Consensus and say, just continue to work on what you're working, and we are forming this group. So it was, quite a super interesting space and place.
Gnosis were, if I remember, I think one of the first projects, right, that were launched out of that Consensus hub at the time. Is that right?
Yeah. So Gnosis was one of the projects that then also a few years later, so actually more than 2 years, we were within or part of Consensus, but then in early 2017 we made the decision that Gnosis should be its own project entity. And
Gnosis at the time, if you talk about a prediction, I'm just curious, when you talk about the efficiency of a prediction market, or how did you think about the use of the technology in creating a more efficient, prediction market?
Yeah, certainly my thinking around prediction markets has changed over the years. So back then I thought they would change the world and kind of make information, or kind of every information more easy to predict or to digest. I think there are all kind of problems with prediction market. That's my thinking now, but certainly the promise was that the technology, the openness would allow kind of to not only have one project or one company building one thing, but have full ecosystems where the core elements are, well, as we call it so often, decentralized, but not owned by a specific entity or party. So that makes it much more easy for ecosystems to emerge. That was the hope, and still is.
Yeah, and there, I mean, if you talk about Gnosis then, or let's say prediction market concept now, I mean, you go onto the Gnosis website and you talk about, securely creating, trading, and holding digital assets on it. That's a massive universe now, right? So,
Yeah.
so how did that journey start or end, or how did you get to where you guys are today?
Yeah, I mean, we were certainly way too optimistic of how fast you could build things. So we wanted to build Gnosis, this prediction market. But at the time, very, very basic tools that we now consider very basic simply didn't exist. So there was no MetaMask, didn't exist, kind of what's now more or less a standard wallet. Even very simple standards like this ERC token standard did not exist when we started within consensus. Later, it did exist. So long story short, over the years, we simply decided, okay, if we wanted to build this, but all the pieces below were missing. So then we started to build those pieces below. So over the years, Gnosis has built the most notable things are the Safe, initially Gnosis Safe. Now it's kind of just the Safe. This multi-sig wallet or more abstract wallets where you can define more complex rules. So it's not like you have just one key and then you own it, or so yes or no, but instead you can have rules, you can have many owners, and you can say 2 out of those 4, or you can have time delays, or you can you make it programmable.
And in that context, Martin, when you talk about a Safe, or I'm an average user and I want to use some safe wallet. I mean, we talk a lot about a trust-based system. I'm putting a lot of faith in the platform that's developing that safer form of security. How do you distinguish, or how does a user distinguish the Gnosis Safe from another platform? What are the distinguishing factors? Are there any that sort of jump out, or?
Yeah, I mean, very practically, it is when it comes to smart contract wallets or kind of those programmable wallets, it is the most used one, and with many billions holding it. Of course, kind of, I would argue, you can read source codes and you can see the audits. Practically, of course, that's not really what's happening. What's happening is that a lot of people agree that it's safe and secure, and therefore
by consensus.
Essentially, yeah.
So take us beyond the Gnosis Safe. What are the other? I mean, there's one piece, just because you were talking about general kind of good, and I know you've pushed a lot the sort of UBI concept, or the circles UBI, but this concept of universal basic income, that's historical. I mean, the long way back, Thomas More, I think 16th century kind of utopia points, etc. But as a concept, then actually, I'd like to hear you talk a little about the UBI concept,
for sure.
Just generally, very, very generally.
For sure. No, I think it ties back to my initial comment on Bitcoin and kind of the discussion of how does money work. And Bitcoin showed kind of, there could be a different way of how money works, and we can have a debate whether Bitcoin is at all money or not, but let's put that aside. But like, if you say, okay, we are able to experiment with new forms, you could say, well, why not create something like Bitcoin? But instead of saying kind of there are 21 million tokens that are distributed to miners, let's say we say the tokens are distributed on a per person basis. So kind of in circles, tokens or coins come into the world on a basis like everyone gets 1 token per hour. So 1 circle represents 1, in a way, human hour. And that's in a way just one way to say, okay, we want to have a digital asset, but we want to have a fair way to initially distribute it. But then, of course, it's also a way to achieve something like UBI, or universal basic income.
And then in the classic sort of UBI or nation state UBI concept, the USA adopts a similar system.
Right.
And they always talk, or they do talk about the downside being, I suppose, the cost. So if suddenly you have X billion people being allocated, whatever it is, $1,000 a month or whatever it is, that cost or that output needs to be reduced on some other form of social contribution, rather. In the Circles network, I mean, how do you attribute a value to that unit of hour?
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, that is up to the people who want to use Circles. So in Circles, it actually goes all the way down to everyone issues their own kind of specific form of Circles, and then you form trust networks where I say I accept yours, you accept mine. And then the question is, why would you accept mine? Well, ideally because I offer something for it. So if I, for example, say I'm willing to work for my own Circles, for my own money, well, that might be a reason for you to accept it, because you might say, well, I might need this work at some point, or someone else might need it.
What are the biggest restricting factors to larger groups? Or maybe there are groups, or there are lots of groups that have adopted, I know that, but what are the restrictive factors to larger groups?
Yeah,
or platforms or industries?
So Circles launched roughly 2 years ago, and fairly quickly over 100,000 people signed up. But then, to be honest, the technology was not ready back then. I think it's getting better and better by the day. But so back then we were still held back by scaling issues, stability issues. So in the end, stuff kind of on a very pure smart contract level and on the pure blockchain level, things are super reliable, and blockchains are ultra reliable. But to actually make it usable, there are a few steps in between, and those pieces are still.
And do the Circles interoperate with each other? If they're all sorts of, let's say, mini economies, can they interoperate practically? Does that work? Those units of account, are they?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the core idea of Circles, that you form this web of trust. So trusting each other means you are in a way willing to exchange your Circles one-to-one, and that of course works transitively. So as long as between the person you want to interact with and yourself there is a path of trust, you can interact. And the second thing we are introducing to Circles right now are what we call group currencies. So you could call them regional currencies. We're starting with a kind of Berlin Circle or Berlin coin, where kind of vendors or some participants might decide, okay, we are using or we are defining a specific set of individual Circles that form this group.
And are there? I mean, can people take advantage of this? How do you protect against the concept of me being part of that circle but not really doing anything, just trying to? That's got to be a classic. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, that is in a way this individual negotiation between people trusting each other. So you to become part of it, you would need to find people that trust you, and of course they could then say, and those are the things we are figuring out, to what extent is then a demand or an expectation from you to at some point in a way contribute back or offer things for Circles as well. In the beginning it's maybe totally fine, you kind of start spend, but if you then always only spend, there might be the expectation, okay, now it's time to also accept.
And how far, Martin, do you think is, I don't know, will there be a point, do you think, I'm asking conceptually, that a huge country will adopt this as a standard? Or?
Yeah.
Or some way from them?
That's hard. Hard to say. But we are working with a network of mayors at least, where they could or where we are exploring things like, at least locally you could use it for public transport, or you have kind of some resources a city has. Whether we come to the country level, we'll see.
But it is interesting, right? Because these sort of private initiatives, or internal autonomous networks that are created, a lot of the time they become like almost sandboxes to see operating versions of something on a smaller scale that can be adopted. Stable coins, we've seen it on lots of different levels. Lots of people start talking about stable coins before they start talking about CBDCs, before they start talking about everything else.
Exactly.
So it's a sort of first step in that direction, right? Okay, and we could talk a long time about UBIs, I think, but you mentioned the the pieces of the Gnosis platform, let's say, and probably the biggest has got to be the Gnosis chain. Would you say? Is that right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, tell us a little bit about the Gnosis chain, or Gnosis chain Ethereum side by side, or you being, you are one of the Ethereum, guys. How you've got to that Ethereum chain sort of position.
Right. So, so again, over the years we did various different projects, but now our focus is the Gnosis chain, and that started roughly 2 years ago, when we had been building applications on Ethereum, but it just became clear on Ethereum itself it will be way too expensive, or it was way too expensive. So a single transaction would cost $20. And for example, for a project like Circles, which is meant to be kind of, you are meant to pay your coffee or kind of make a $2 purchase with it. Of course, it doesn't work if you have a transaction fee of $20. So
the same happened with NFTs, right? So low value NFTs,
for sure.
Transactions, exchanges, $20 on $50 value transactions.
So basically, back then we were looking for alternatives, and that was there was one chain, called XDAI, that was exactly doing that. Was like Ethereum, but it was much cheaper to use. And back then they used a simpler consensus algorithm called proof of authority, where essentially you have a number of trusted people that kind of produce the blocks. And again, that was our immediate solution to say, okay, for those transactions that cannot afford in a way the high security and therefore also the high costs of Ethereum, we will use this as well, and started to do all our applications, kind of the Safe, CowSwap, and Circles actually, on this chain as well. Over the years, we then decided, okay, we want to double down on this chain and want to develop it further and actually have a full roadmap for decentralization, because that was one of the biggest weaknesses of that chain, that it was as Ethereum but much more centralized. And so a year ago we made a large and also pretty probably novel thing, kind of did a token merger with that project. So in a way we reached out to our community, to the community of that chain, and said, okay, should we maybe merge the two projects? And in the end, that's what we did. So anyone of the kind of what was called the stake token, they could redeem their tokens for specific amount of GNO. And since then, this chain is the Gnosis chain. And we are pushing very hard to make it the chain as decentralized as Ethereum. One of our core concepts is that really anyone should become a validator and therefore also a block producer on this chain. So for every chain, one key question you can ask is who is actually allowed, or who's actually able to produce a new block, to kind of add new transactions to the chain. And I would say currently Gnosis chain is the chain where the barrier to do that is the lowest of all chains. So in our case, you just need one single GNO, which is currently $120, something like that. That's enough to become a validator. Then you are one out of 100,000 validators. So on average, roughly every 3 weeks, you will get the right to produce one block.
100,000 is a lot of validators.
Yes.
So I think at Ethereum, we were talking before, was about 400K.
Yeah.
But the next below Gnosis chain is like 4,000 or 3,000 or something.
Probably even less.
Yeah, exactly. And let me ask you another question around that. To what extent, like we talk about transaction costs on Ethereum, etc. But would you say there's a bit of a, I'm not going to call it a protocol war, but there are lots of different protocols developing in different ways.
Yeah.
I think some people say, like, in pursuing like faster, cheaper transaction networks, a lot of the time they give up decentralization to an extent. They move to sort of more. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I mean that's fair. So at the end, you have kind of those three things. So you have security, decentralization, and scalability. And yeah, it's really really hard to have all three. So usually you have to give up one. And I would say many of the side chains have given up on the decentralization, at least to some extent. And we at least we said, okay, there are enough other EVM chains that compromise on decentralization. We want to be another EVM chain besides Ethereum that does not compromise on decentralization. So that's kind of the first thing we want to make sure that people are at home able to run a validator, and kind of that's our hard requirement. And then, of course, we still want to push on the other two things as far as we can, but without compromising decentralization. So, of course, that can mean that at the end, our transaction fees will also go up. And in a way, that would be, to some extent, also a good thing, because it means, well, there is, I mean, Ethereum is also, of course, a huge success in people being willing to pay so much for transactions. So in a way, you can say we are just trying to produce more of Ethereum.
And what? So let's create our own prediction market. The protocol. I mean, where do you think in 10 years' time, from a blockchain universe, as broad as you can imagine the term, what will be the protocol of the future? What will distinguish one from another? Where will things go? Just your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of expect that actually security and scalability will be solved essentially. It will still take time, but the progress of specifically zero knowledge technology where it's able for just someone to do very hard and expensive computation, but then that computation does not need to, or anyone else can just verify that this computation was done in a very, very cheap way. That's really a game changer for those challenges. So what we believe, the factors that distinguishes different chains will actually be the decentralization, and that's actually the hard thing to build a system that is decentralized. So that's why that's kind of our main focus, to say there are all kind of factors that as soon as you start a chain, often things get more efficient if they are if they are decentralized. So there is a natural tendency towards centralization. So again, that's why we think that's.
And let me tell you, I mean, this is a really natural sort of follow-on question, and it's a super difficult one, because I think that's absolutely right. But the definition of decentralization doesn't really exist. So there are so many different ways that people can think and talk about. I think I mentioned to you before. Legally, you have a direction of travel, which is this new wording around control or influence, etc. Some people, I mean, they all have slightly different. But how do you think that you can get to your defined decentralization goal?
Yeah, I think you just need to honestly look at the system. So if you define just one metric, then it's probably easy to optimize for this metric and have other parts of the system that are totally not decentralized. So it's very hard to define decentralization in just one number. Also, kind of that's why I would say proud that we have so many validators, but that of course not the full truth. So currently, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, there are other parts that are less decentralized in Gnosis chain, but we want to be honest and clear about it, and kind of just tackle all the aspects. So it's the number of validators is one, but of course if a single entity controls a lot of validators, then that doesn't really help. So it's kind of what entities control it, how are they geographically distributed, how's the knowledge spread about the technology. If there's essentially just one team, or even within the team 3 guys that really understand how something works, of course that is a big how do the bridges work, how are most of the assets on a single exchange? Are there specific oracles that have a lot of power? So
What do you mean by an oracle? I know that
Mhm.
you'll be able to give a lot of detail, but talk about oracles very generally in that context.
yeah, there are there are generally blockchains have the need to get real world information, and if all the important oracles, so that's usually a price feed, for example, if they always come just from one source, then of course that is against the idea of decentralization, because this one entity or one source could have significant or has then significant influence about this chain.
Does it ultimately come down to always to that sort of central point of authority, central point of failure, central point of control? I mean, I suppose that's what can't exist if you want to create an argument around decentralization. Would you agree with that, or?
Yes. So I mean, of course, the situation around Tornado has revealed in a way those sources. So of course, if there is any single entity that can do one action and then the system starts to in the worst case stop, or at least stops a specific functionality of some entity, then of course that violates the idea of decentralization.
Talk. I mean, you mentioned Tornado, and I'd love to hear you sort of set the scene for Tornado Cash and the E05 related issues that appeared. I mean, that's a super interesting. There's lots of lines that we can talk about there, but I'd love to hear your perspective of what happened. Generally.
I think there are at least two layers to it. So one is the pure, probably also fight or negotiation between what level of privacy is acceptable and is also necessary, and kind of that is to some extent something that policymakers and the public have to kind of figure out. And what happened here is that Tornado Cash was one of the first protocols that made it very easy and very practical, relatively easy to use kind of a privacy technology. So the default behavior is on Ethereum, if you have an account, you transfer it to another account that's immediately kind of linkable. So it's very easy. And for example, I have my account Köppelmann.es where I have my kind of just name and ENS name. So everyone knows that account is from myself. And if I would use, or sooner or later I will transact with all the other accounts I have. If I regularly transact in between, it's very easy to say, okay, kind of all those accounts that are mine. And of course, that is probably not something we want. So kind of everyone can ask themselves, would they want all their bank accounts, and actually not even kind of how much money they have, but actually every individual transaction being publicly exposed. And Tornado Cash was one of the first projects within Ethereum. So kind of Zcash, they have been kind of the original creators of the concept behind that. But Zcash was its own world or its own universe. And I think it's fair to say that much more transactions and much more activity just happened on Ethereum. And on Ethereum, this privacy technology was not really available until Tornado comes. And in Tornado, it was possible to essentially transfer from one account you hold to another account you hold without making this link public. And again, I'd say that was and is a very, very important piece towards bringing making it actually feasible to. We were talking about kind of stuff like circles and the idea that you do day-to-day transactions on the blockchain, and I would say blockchain is not ready for that yet because this privacy part is missing. So Tornado was kind of first step in this direction. Of course, unfortunately, what happened was that Tornado was still not very easy to use. So people wouldn't use it by default in their day-to-day transactions. So probably the two user groups were one kind of somewhat advanced developers that were conscious of that and kind of and kind of the early adopters. But then, of course, part of the truth is that indeed hackers and those who have stolen money in various forms of.
Do you see? I mean, we see authorities reacting in lots of different ways all over the world in very, very different ways, and we're not going to go into all of that. But I mean, to what extent do you see, taking advantage of the technology, so zero knowledge based compliance infrastructure? Do you see that as like something that's going to develop or something that's going to happen? So, can you deal with the concerns of a regulatory authority or enforcement agency with new technical ways, embedded compliance concepts or anything like that? Or is that just too far down the line?
No, for sure. I mean, that is very, very possible. And I would say in many cases, it's also very desirable to prove a specific fact about yourself without
the right privacy within the right sort of privacy framework.
Right. I mean, just like in the last years of the whole Corona crisis, I'm not sure. Kind of, I probably to thousands of entities I gave out my phone number, my address, my name. And there would be in principle there would be technology out there that kind of where you can have the same level of, I don't know, someone can reach me or whatever the goal of that is, you can reach this goal without leaking your information all over the place.
But I mean, look, let's see. I personally, I think that the risks are there. It can be addressed in the right way, taking advantage of the technology in the right way, or it can be completely ignored. And if it's completely ignored, for me, I think it's a question of time before agencies start to, redefine the concept of a VASP or just try to literally bring the entire blockchain universe within the scope of the definition of a VASP, which isn't really in anyone's interest. I'm a big proponent for trying to evolve the application and use of technology in new ways. But let's see how that happens. I wanted to follow up on something else and take advantage of you being here and your time. Because we've talked a little bit about decentralization, about the Gnosis chain, etc. We haven't talked about CowSwap, and I'm really interested in that, almost in the context of a DEX. You can talk a little bit about what a DEX is to start. I think that makes sense. And whether that probably is the primary use of decentralized finance or decentralized finance ecosystems.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear your view on, firstly, the DeFi space, and mostly in the context of like CowSwap or DEX, and we can talk a little bit about a few issues after that. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you on that stuff.
Yeah, so CowSwap is a project that also started with the Gnosis, initially as Gnosis protocol, but then became its own, or is now its own protocol, and it really looked tightly at all the different interactions that are happening if you trade on a decentralized exchange. So first, a little bit the probably the history of DEXs. I think the breakthrough that made them really popular was this concept of automated market makers. So, and the concept that users, as a user, you could kind of just put two tokens into some automated market maker, and essentially you would provide those tokens as liquidity for others to trade, and then others could essentially just send one token to this contract and got the other out. And I think this concept was extremely important for this explosion of tokens and assets. And I mean, that is to some extent what we expect, that the range of things that will be tokenized will be much larger, and the kind of the hurdle to do so, to tokenize something, will become much lower than, let's say, previously making a public a company public and bringing it to the stock exchange. And just this idea that we now have much more assets will probably also require different market mechanisms, because you cannot necessarily have for each of those assets a sophisticated, many sophisticated traders and real-time quotes and all those things, because if the asset is much smaller and kind of just a handful of people trade it, those contracts evolved, those automated market makers, and Uniswap is the most prominent one here. And now those contracts exist that facilitate this simple rules. Kind of, you send one token to it and you get specific quantity back. And kind of going forward, users were using that and trading billions of dollars against those contracts. But it turns out that there are handful of specific interactions where a single user is not necessarily equipped in the best way to get a good price out of that. So they send their transactions, and at the moment they send their transaction, this transaction is public, so anyone in the world can see this transaction is going to happen, but it has not happened yet. So this, it's just a few seconds, but that's in terms of trading, that's ages. In this seconds where this transaction is public, it's easy for someone else to insert. So I want to buy a specific token. Someone else inserts the transaction and buys it first, and then I need to buy it at a higher price. And then kind of this, probably the same person can immediately, then after I bought it at the higher price, sell it. And make some arbitrage.
Margin,
Right. And that also ties back to the question of decentralization: who is actually able to do it, and who is actually able to do that in the most efficient way? And those are actually the block producers. So that was previously the miners in proof of work, and now it's the validators in proof of stake, because they ultimately decide what the order of the transactions is.
Most people aren't really aware of that as well, right? I mean, that's fair to say.
100%. But it is a simple reality. If you kind of just submit your trade on a quote unquote regular DEX, there is a good chance that exactly that will happen. And of course, the outcome for you as user is also not horrible. You will probably lose 20 basis points, or 0.2% of, or maybe even less, but it's real.
It's important. It is important. I think it's important for people to understand that, because conceptually it's a sort of pure peer-to-peer, disintermediated, fair system, but it is subject to these MEV-related sort of concepts.
Right. So in that case, it is. I mean, at the end, it's still you are interacting with the smart contract, but you are in a way doing it through the validator, because the validator at the end bundles your transaction. So in a way, you can make a point that this validator to some extent has some intermediary power here. So that's where CowSwap comes in. And what we do in CowSwap is that you as a user, you don't send this your transaction to the miner, the validator, that will not act in your best interest, or at least not, or many have decided to. And I think that's also somewhat an open debate, whether should that be allowed.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, is this legal? And even if it's legal, is it ethical? Anyhow, that aside, the reality is many say it's okay, or whatever, act as if it would be okay to extract this value. So in contrast, on CowSwap, you are, as a user, you are you are not sending your transaction to the miner. You are kind of doing what we call a meta transaction. So you're just describing what you want to do in a way, what you want to trade, without the exact kind of saying I want to interact with that smart contract. And then we have what we call a solver competition. So we have different entities that can now compete to settle those trades. So we actually even batch a handful of trades. So kind of different traders put their trades in, and we decide kind of who's allowed to settle them by a competition, where the goal of the competition is what we call maximize trader welfare. So essentially now kind of 14 solvers can submit their numbers and say kind of I can settle it in a way, I can use this contract, or I can combine those trades, or there are all kind of optimizations they can do, and say in the end that's the price the user will get. And again, then the one will be selected that offers the highest price to the user. And in CowSwap, then it's their risk. So we this whole question of they still at the end need to put this transaction on the blockchain. So in the way they will have the same challenge, but in this model we put the risk on them. So kind of if they at the end would get sandwiched, they need to pay it. And of course, what happens in practice is that there are some validators that kind of give extra channels where you can kind of send them this transaction with the explicit promise: if you send it via this channel, it will not be seen by anyone until it's on the blockchain. So if you are a professional, there are ways to mitigate that, and kind of that's the whole story of CowSwap. So as a user, you don't give your transaction to the public mempool where people will act against your interest. You give it to those solvers with this competition to give you the best price, and it's their job to.
So you've identified that issue and you sort of dealt with it within the infrastructure that you've built. Do you think, and talking like super generally, I suppose, as well as this, the average user on the street, or where like the future is all on the Gnosis chain, let's just say, what do you think are the kind of two things? What are the sort of most real world applications that you see being built, or the biggest purpose that you could serve? And then secondly, how far away are we from the average user's access to these networks? Even something like CowSwap, for the average guy on the street, it's difficult. How far away are we from that? So define sort of purposes of your, where you want to get to and how you're going to get there.
I would certainly say we want to see much more real world use cases. So kind of I would broadly define that as simply things people do very regularly, daily, and also specifically things that are not where it's not part of the core concept that there's some speculative element of it. I mean, I'm not against whatever speculative things, but it's clear everything that relies on, I don't know, some prices go up and so on, that can at max, that can be maybe some very early use cases that open up a field, but it's never going to be a kind of sustainable and really long-term value producing use case. So in my view, I absolutely want to see the most simple thing that still does not really happen on scale on blockchains is payment. So I mean, we have talked about it. Or I think like even in the early Bitcoin days, kind of that was meant to be cross-border payment and so on. That was meant to be a use case for Bitcoin. At scale, it never really happened. And I don't know exactly when it will happen, but I do hope, and I do think the signs are much clearer that this will eventually
lightning
happen.
And everything else. Let's see.
Yeah, I mean, I would bet actually in this case more on stablecoins. And there's one project we are working on that quite seamlessly tries to combine credit card payments and crypto payments. So it turns out it's actually possible to authorize actually a crypto or Ethereum transaction with a credit card. So actually it's possible on this chip to do the required computation and even broadcast this transaction via in this case the Visa network. And those I would call it bridging technology, but that might very well be required to come to mass adoption. So if you, for example, look back at Skype, then nowadays people just use Skype. I mean, kind of nowadays the communication, or probably they use now Zoom or whatever, but kind of the communication now happens purely within the internet. Most voice calls are just purely internet to internet. But I think a very important factor to go there was at the beginning that it was possible if you were already on Skype, but the other person would still use landline, then there was this period where it was possible to call from Skype to a landline. And I think that bridging technology, so eventually then both people have Skype and then it can completely work over the internet. And eventually both people will have crypto and it will completely work over crypto.
But how far away, and that's the sort of question. On Skype, everyone can, it's pretty easy, or do a WhatsApp call or whatever it is. People don't really even think about the underlying technology. It's just a simple to use application interaction.
No,
the
for
crypto
sure.
universe, especially the DEX related universe, or ledger interaction with your MetaMask and X, it's not there for the guy off the street, right?
No, for sure. And I mean, I would say it's the same way as if you do a call now, you of course also don't really think about whether you are now using the landline or even like if you use your mobile, then most of the time it will actually not go through the mobile network, but it will actually use still the internet as an underlying protocol, but you don't really care, and kind of it's fairly abstracted away. And in the same way, it will and should be with blockchain. So at some point you will do your payment and you will potentially still use your card, but it will completely go through the underlying pipes will just be different ones, but you don't really care, and you don't have to care too much about it.
Well, Marcy, I think you guys are doing an amazing job, and like you said, it needs people and platforms pushing boundaries. Everyone does that in slightly different ways. Well, Xapo, where we're sitting today, is doing it in its own way, pushing boundaries between the financial services and banking world and the VASP and crypto BTC universe. So I think it's important, and I'm super glad to talk to you as part of that ecosystem. It's been awesome speaking to you. I'm sure we could talk for a long time, but I think we'll draw things to a close if that makes sense. But thank you very much for coming in. Thanks for watching Mavericks, brought to you by Xapo Bank. Please like and subscribe for more episodes.